Some people pass through this world and leave a mark so deep that they become legends, not merely for what they accomplished, but for what they stood for. Everyone knows the name Ulysses S. Grant. He is the man who won the war, the face on the money, the general who took Lee's surrender and then took the White House. If you asked 100 people to name the Union general the South feared the most, almost all of them would say Grant, and almost all of them would be wrong. Because if you could go back and ask the men who actually fought for the Confederacy, the veterans who survived the war and carried its memory for the rest of their lives, you would hear a different name. Not the name of the man who beat them, the name of the man they could not forgive. They respected Grant. They feared this other man with something closer to dread, and they passed that dread down to their sons and their grandsons. He was shorter than the legends, barely 5 feet 5 inches tall, with a temper like a struck match and a way of studying a map as if it were already on fire. His name was Philip Sheridan, and the reason the South came to fear him more than the man who actually won the war is one of the strangest and most revealing stories the entire Civil War ever produced. To understand it, you first have to understand the difference between losing a battle and losing everything you have left in the world. Here is the first strange thing about Philip Sheridan. For a man who terrified an entire region, he is almost invisible today. Ask the average person to picture a Union general, and they will give you Grant with his cigar, or Sherman with his wild eyes, or the long gray dignity of Lee on the other side of the line. Sheridan is a blur. A cavalry officer, maybe. A name on a street sign somewhere. The history channels that churn out documentaries by the dozen tend to hand him that same flat treatment, a recital of dates and battles read off a page with no pulse in it, and in doing so, they miss the only thing about him that actually matters, which is why he left a scar in the Southern memory that the far more famous generals never did. Sheridan came from nothing. The son of Irish immigrants, raised poor in Ohio, he scraped his way through West Point and very nearly did not graduate at all, suspended for a year after he went after another cadet in a rage. He was small, abrasive, and ferociously aggressive, the kind of officer who made his superiors uneasy and made the enemy bleed. Grant saw what he was almost at once, and in 1864, when Grant rose to command all the armies of the Union, he reached for Sheridan and pointed him at a problem that had humiliated every Union general sent against it before him. That problem was a long green valley in Virginia, and the campaign Sheridan ran there is the reason the word Sheridan could still make an old man's jaw tighten 50 years after the guns fell silent. Before we go any further, let me be blunt with you, because this is exactly the kind of story this channel was built to tell. If you want the version of history the textbooks crushed down into one bloodless little paragraph, the real version, the one with the names and the fire and the cost, then stop right now and subscribe. That is the entire reason this place exists, and there is more of it coming every week. Hit subscribe, and let us get back to the man Grant aimed at the Shenandoah Valley like a loaded gun. The Shenandoah Valley was not just farmland. It was the breadbasket of the Confederacy, more than 100 miles of some of the richest soil in the South, and for 3 long years it had fed Lee's army and served as a hidden highway from which Confederate forces could threaten Washington itself. Every Union general sent into that valley had been outmaneuvered, embarrassed, and thrown back out of it. So Grant made a decision. The answer, he concluded, was not to win the valley. It was to end it. His orders to Sheridan were explicit, and they were the kind of order that had rarely in American history been written down so plainly. Grant told him to strip the valley bare, to carry off everything that could feed an army, and to burn everything that could not, until the land itself could no longer sustain a single soldier. The most famous line of that instruction has survived precisely because it is so cold that it sounds almost like a grim joke. Grant said that when the work was done, a crow flying across the valley would have to carry its own rations to get to the other side. Sheridan did not flinch from it. In the autumn of 1864, his army moved down the valley doing exactly what it had been told to do, and the people who lived through it gave it a name with no exaggeration in it at all. They called it the burning. Soldiers put the torch to barns swollen with the harvest that had only just been gathered. They burned the mills that ground the grain, the haystacks, the storehouses, the fences. They drove off the cattle and the horses and the sheep, and whatever they could not drive off, they killed where it stood. Smoke hung over the valley for days, a low gray ceiling visible for miles in every direction, and beneath it, the families who lived there stood in their own yards and watched a full year of work and an entire winter of survival burn away in a single afternoon. And this is the distinction the whole story turns on, the one thing that separates Sheridan from Grant in the Southern mind forever. A soldier can lose a battle and still make his peace with it. He marched, he fought, he was beaten by a better army or worse luck, and he can carry that defeat with a certain grim dignity for the rest of his days. But the families of the Shenandoah did not lose a battle. They lost their homes, their food, and every means they had of surviving the cold months that were coming. The burning was not aimed at an army. It was aimed at the things standing behind the army, the farms and the families that made the war possible in the first place, and every man, woman, and child who lived through it understood that the general giving those orders had decided that their suffering was now a legitimate weapon of war. It is important to be clear about something at this exact point, because it is the difference between history and propaganda. This was not Sheridan, the lone monster, indulging some private cruelty. This was documented strategy, the same hard logic that Sherman was carrying through Georgia at almost the very same moment, and the man who gave the order was Grant. Sheridan was the instrument, but the instrument is what people remember, because the instrument is the face you actually see standing in your own front yard. Grant gave the order from a tent 100 miles away. Sheridan was the man on the horse, watching your barn burn. That is why the hatred fastened itself onto him, and not onto the man above him, and it is why the Valley would remember that season under one single word for generations to come: the burning. But if the Valley taught the South to hate Philip Sheridan, the very next thing he did taught them something far worse. It taught them that he could not be beaten even when he had already lost. On the morning of October the 19th, 1864, the Confederates in the Valley made one last desperate attempt to turn the whole war around, and for a few hours it worked better than they could ever have dreamed. Under the cover of a heavy fog, the army of General Jubal Early launched a surprise attack on Sheridan's camp along Cedar Creek. The Union soldiers were caught half asleep, and their lines simply collapsed. Whole divisions broke and ran. By the middle of the morning, the Confederates had overrun the camps, captured the guns, and sent thousands of Union men streaming north up the road in a panicked, broken retreat. For those few hours, it was one of the most stunning reversals of the entire war. And Philip Sheridan was not even there. He had been away in Winchester, some 20 miles to the north, returning from a meeting in Washington. He woke to the distant grumble of artillery and understood at once exactly what it meant. What he did next turned into legend. He got on his horse and he rode 20 miles, hard, down a road choked with his own fleeing soldiers. And as he rode, he did something almost no general in the whole of military history has ever managed to do. He turned a route around with nothing but his own body and his own will. He rode straight into the streams of running men, and witnesses said he shouted at them and cursed them and told them they were going back, that they would sleep in their own camps that very night. And the strangest part of all is that they believed him. Men who had thrown their rifles into the ditch picked them up again and turned around. The sight of him, small and furious and absolutely certain, did what no written order could ever have done. By the afternoon, he had reformed a shattered, beaten army into a solid line of battle, and before the sun went down, he hurled it forward and smashed Early so completely that the Confederate threat in the Shenandoah was finished for good. In the North, the ride became a poem, printed and recited until every schoolchild in the country knew it by heart, the gallant little general galloping in to save the day. But look at the same afternoon from the other side of the line, from inside the Confederate camp that had won the battle by noon and lost it by dark. For them, Cedar Creek was not a poem. It was a nightmare. They had done everything right. They had surprised him, broken him, beaten him in open battle, and somehow it had not been enough because the man simply refused to accept a defeat that was already sitting in his hands. An enemy you can beat is frightening enough. An enemy who reaches in and takes your victory back from you after you have already won it is something else entirely. After Cedar Creek, the men who had to fight Philip Sheridan stopped believing they could beat him at all. And yet the thing that truly sealed his name in the memory of the South was still to come, in the final desperate week of the war, when the Confederacy was already dying and one man made absolutely certain it could never crawl away to rise and fight again. By the spring of 1865, Lee's army was a ghost of the force it had once been, starving, shrinking, holding the long lines around Petersburg by sheer stubborn will. When those lines finally cracked, Lee had one hope left, the same hope that every cornered army clings to slip away in the night, move fast, link up with the other Confederate forces still in the field, and somehow keep the war alive. Everyone remembers that it was Grant who accepted Lee's surrender at Appomattox. Far fewer people understand exactly who it was that made that surrender unavoidable. It was Sheridan. While Grant directed the larger pursuit, it was Sheridan's cavalry that actually ran Lee to ground. At a crossroads called Five Forks on the 1st of April, Sheridan shattered the Confederate flank and tore the entire Petersburg defense wide open, forcing Lee to abandon the city overnight. Then, as Lee's hungry column staggered west searching for food and an open road, Sheridan refused to let them breathe. He drove his horsemen in a relentless parallel chase, snapping at the edges of the retreat, and at a place called Sailor's Creek he caught an enormous portion of Lee's army and destroyed it, taking thousands of prisoners in a single afternoon. Lee, watching his men come streaming back in ruin, is said to have cried out, asking whether his army had simply dissolved. Then came the final stroke. As Lee made one last push toward the supply trains waiting at Appomattox Station, the last food his starving men would ever see, it was Sheridan's cavalry that reached them first, seized the trains, and flung itself across the road directly in front of the Confederate advance. When Lee looked for any way out at all on the morning of April the 9th, he found Sheridan's troopers planted across his only road, with the Union infantry coming up fast behind them. There was no longer a way through. The trap was shut, and the man who had shut it was Philip Sheridan. So when the two great men finally met in that quiet parlor at Appomattox to end the war with dignity, it is worth remembering the precise choreography of how they got there. Grant was the one who sat down and wrote out the generous terms. But Grant only ever got to be magnanimous because Sheridan had already made escape impossible. Grant offered the open hand. Sheridan was the closed fist that had backed Lee into the very room where that hand could be offered. And the South understood that division of labor perfectly. They simply drew very different conclusions about the two men who performed it. Which brings us all the way back to the question we started with, the one that sounds impossible until you finally see the war the way the people who lost it saw it. How could the South fear and hate Philip Sheridan more than the man who actually defeated them? The answer lies in those last days at Appomattox, and in everything that came before them. When Lee surrendered, Grant treated him and his men with a generosity that stunned the entire South. He let the officers keep their sidearms. He let the soldiers keep their own horses so that they could go home and put in a spring crop. He sent his own rations into the starving Confederate camp, and he forbade his men from cheering because, he said, the rebels were their countrymen once again. Lee rode away from that meeting with his dignity fully intact, and he spoke of Grant with genuine respect for the rest of his life. Grant had beaten them, yes, but he had beaten them like a soldier, face to face, and then he had offered his hand. A man can make peace with an enemy like that. Sheridan offered no hand. There was no famous gesture of mercy from him, no single moment of grace that the South could hold on to in the hard years afterward. What they had from Sheridan was the smoke over the Shenandoah and the memory of their grandmother's barns burning against the autumn sky. They could respect the man who had outfought them. They could never forgive the man who had burned their winter and starved their children and never once appeared to feel the weight of any of it. Grant took their surrender. Sheridan took their last belief that war still had any rules left in it at all. And in the long memory of a defeated people, it is never the man who wins who becomes the villain. It is the man who makes you feel, deep in your bones, that the losing is never truly going to end. For Sheridan's enemies, the losing did not end at Appomattox. After the war, the government made him military governor over Louisiana and Texas, and he ruled that conquered corner of the South with the same iron he had used on the Valley. He threw elected governors out of their offices. He removed officials he judged disloyal, and he did it so harshly that he was eventually pulled from the post for going too far even for the men who had appointed him. It was Sheridan who once remarked that if he owned both Texas and hell, he would rent out Texas and go live in hell. To the white South, that single sentence was the whole man. The contempt, the hardness, the flat refusal to pretend at anything softer. The war had ended in a surrender. Sheridan, in their eyes, never surrendered anything. And that is why the hatred outlived the men who first felt it and got handed down like a family heirloom for generation after generation. History, in the end, was kinder to Philip Sheridan than the South ever was. He rose to command the entire United States Army, and he died with full national honors, his ride carved into legend, his Valley campaign studied for decades as a model of how a modern war is actually won. The men who hated him faded away, and so, slowly, did most of the memory of why. But the thing he represented did not fade at all. Because the burning of the Shenandoah was never really about one valley, or one general, or one terrible autumn. It was a glimpse of a new kind of war, the kind that stops aiming only at armies and starts aiming at everything that feeds them, every barn and field and family behind the lines. Sheridan was only one of the men who learned to fight that way. The other was carving his own road of fire all the way to the sea, 300 miles to the south, at almost the very same time. And what those two men did together in that single autumn would quietly change what the word war was going to mean for the next 100 years.